I am guessing that most of you have never heard of Toraja. It is a regency in Indonesia, which is similar to a county in America. My wife and I hired a photographic tour guide for parts of Indonesia in the summer of 2022. After the guide read our blog at www.mindstormphoto.com, he said we really truly had to see Toraja. By that time I was accepting his expertise, and we agreed to add Toraja to our tour. Wow, was this an eye-opener to a society I had thought had expired in the 15th century. I want to give you a glimpse into this society that left us with our jaws on the floor for a week of touring. Torajan life revolves around death. That is a central concept guiding all Torajan actions. They spend their entire life preparing to die, which they believe will lead them to an eternity in heaven. Despite this focus on death, there is no morbid sense about them. Indeed, they seem to be some of the happiest people we have met in the 97 countries we have visited so far. The main diet of the 450,000 Torajans consists of rice. Rice fields can be seen on almost every piece of land that does not have a house or a rice barn. The climate allows rice to be planted and harvested year-round. Almost all farm work is done manually, and it takes many people to plant a rice field and later to harvest it. Therefore, rice fields are planted on a staggered schedule. This allows an entire village to work together to plant a new field, and later the entire village can also harvest the field, going from field to field as a crop ripens. Because of this practice, though we were only there for a week, we were able to watch fields being planted and could also photograph numerous ripe fields and rice being harvested. It would be easy to create an entire slideshow of just the rice fields, but that is not the surprising aspect of Torajan society. It is important to remember, though, that rice is the bulk of their diet to help understand how their death is handled. We visited the Londa burial caves to see an example of how Torajan people managed their dead some 800 years ago. As you enter the caves, you feel like you are walking into a scene starring Indiana Jones. There are rows of ancient coffins hung on the cavern walls with human skulls everywhere. Centuries ago, bodies were buried high in hidden caverns where thieves would hopefully not bother them. A wooden tautau was created to guard over their grave. When this burial site was active, such effigies were crude figures. We will see modern effigy later. Torajan people accept death as a normal part of life and do not fear it. Two young girls followed us into the cave and obviously consider the coffins and skulls as normal. Toraja is a very class-based society. There are only two classes, the nobles and the commoners. Nobles are believed to be the direct descendants of a person who descended from heaven. One aspect of Torajan life that stands out is the houses of the nobles, called tongganans. Every house looks identical to every other house. Whether the house was made this year or 100 years ago, the shape, structure, and size is identical. The only variation is that some of the older houses have moss on the roofs and the amount of ornamentation on their front. Some houses have a bull's head mounted in front, others do not. Why? When I asked, it was explained that a house cannot place a bull on the front until it has been blessed. That blessing cannot be done until a first funeral of the village following completion of the house. If a member of the family that owns the house dies before the blessing, then no bull may ever be put on the front. The horns on the front are from funeral celebrations. Many horns indicate a prestigious family and a house that has been occupied by the same family for generations. Most villages have what appear to be two rows of houses directly across from each other. One row, though, is habitation, while the other row consists of rice barns, one barn for each house. They look identical, with the exception of the lower support structure. The rice barns have a more robust base due to the weight they support. We visited the Bolu local animal market in Toraja. This market primarily sells water buffalo and pigs for use in the various funeral rituals. Tens of thousands of water buffalo are needed each year for funeral rituals. They are expected to accompany the dead to the afterlife, and families go into debt to buy the animals in this bull market. Based on the shortage of buffalo and pigs, most are imported from other islands, such as Java, to fill the need. Buffalo for a funeral could cost anywhere from $1,200 for a small black buffalo to $3,000 or $4,000 for an older bull with longer horns, and up to $38,000 for a prize blue-eyed Mercedes bull with mottled color and light-colored faces. During our week here, we had extensive contact with several noble families, though no more than passing interaction with commoners. As such, I'm mostly describing the life and death of various noble citizens that we witnessed. Funerals in Toraja are long, complicated affairs, often years in planning, with days of activities. The wealth and prestige of a family is measured partly by the number of buffaloes and pigs sacrificed at a funeral. We attended our first funeral in Toraja for a very wealthy woman in the village of Toraja. She had 16 children and was well connected with the government. For this funeral, there were 65 water buffaloes sacrificed and 300 pigs. We attended the first day of the event, which revolves around carrying the body for viewing and the sacrifice of buffaloes. Funerals in Toraja follow very strict and very detailed protocols. Each step is critical in the Toraja traditions to ensure that the deceased properly find their way to heaven, rather than hanging around the descendants and bringing them bad luck. The Torajan people view death as a journey that they prepare for, and not as a tragedy. They save money all their lives for this occasion. Wealthy funerals include the construction of temporary bamboo platforms for the guests to use during festivities. It took 4 months to build the 85 buildings for this funeral. These structures will all be torn down 7 days after the funeral completion. The families welcomed strangers to what Westerners would consider a very private event, so we got to sit in the VIP section. The more guests that attended festivities, the more successful a funeral is considered to be, which brings additional prestige to the surviving family. The procession is quite festive, led by musicians. Along the way, the bola, which transfers the body, is often shaken and even dropped as a way to wake up the deceased. The procession brings the bola to the funeral grounds. Traditionally, the bola is then hoisted to the top of the tower in the center of the festival grounds. It was rather humorous to watch these pallbearers as they approached the tower, though. The bola was first carried to the base of the stairs. A man then went to the top with a bamboo pole and measured the height of the opening at the top of the tower by placing his hand on the appropriate location of the pole. He then climbed back down and placed his measured pole against the bola. Heads were shaking and men were pointing to the tower. Finally, they realized the maker of the bola had not communicated properly with the maker of the tower, and the bola would not fit. At that point, the men disassembled the bola and carried the casket up alone. Seeing them strain made it obvious how heavy that one piece alone was. Then there is the sacrifice of the bulls. When there are large numbers of bulls being sacrificed, the process occurs over several days. After death, the animals are expertly carved up and the meat is distributed to those attending. None of the animal is wasted, and the animals sacrificed in these funerals provide a significant portion of the people's proteins in their meals. Because there are no refrigerators, some of the meat is eaten quickly, the rest is dried, and then provides protein over the following year. At the end of the first day is a bullfight. Torajan bullfights are not like those in Latin America or Mexico. Here, there is no human on horseback harassing and finally killing the bull. Instead, in Torajan bullfights, 2 bulls are urged towards each other and encouraged to fight. Significant betting happens in the audience during these events. These particular bulls did not want any part of it, though. This pair was apparently pacifists. They simply refused to fight at all. No matter how hard their owners pushed or water was thrown on them, they just turned, looked at the audience, and then started eating the grass. Somehow I think they were the smartest animals in the group, and the real winners in the end. In more recent times, Torajans create their burial sites in solid rocky cliffs. Slots for the body are carved into the stone by hand, often taking months of laborious work for a single burial. Christians in the West often bury their loved ones near their family. Torajans do the same, though they choose a large cliff face in which to carve numerous slots rather than holes in the ground. Locally, this is called the Big Stone. and contains over 100 such burial slots. Looking up the face, you can see many with tautaus at the grave entrance. Many of the more recent tombs have photographs and frequently replenished offerings, so that the dead is never hungry or thirsty. Sometimes dozens of family members spanning several generations will be buried in a single slot. Bolas are used to carry the body from the funeral celebration to the burial site, and you can see many of them lined up at the base of the rock. These are from recent burials and will deteriorate with time, replaced by the bolas from new burials. Here's another rock wall that has been used for generations to bury the dead in Limo. This is similar to the big stone shown earlier. Many of the Torajans were converted to Christianity in the early 1900s. The Torajans insisted on continuing their Aluk traditions, though, regardless of what the Christian missionaries preached. Initially, the Christian priests refused to attend the Aluk ceremonies that we have been showing, saying they did not follow the preaching of Jesus. The Torajans told the priests that if they did not attend, they could not have any of the meat from the sacrifices. Since that is a primary source of protein in the local diet, the priests caved. They can now sometimes be seen giving their own blessings, which then results in them receiving a portion of the meat from the animal sacrifices that they disdain. When we walked around the village of Nemo, we stopped to visit a local tautau maker. These days, most of the tautaus are targeted at tourists. A true tautau for a prestigious deceased leader of the village may take up to 3 months to carve. We were invited to visit the interiors of 2 of the homes of people who had recently died. The decorations are simple, with some antiques and a few old photos. The Torajans spend their daily lives on the outside of their homes and use their homes only for sleeping. Even furniture is almost non-existent inside the homes. One of the homes we visited was of Martin Tanapa, a prestigious man who died in March 2022. It takes many months to prepare for a funeral of a prestigious member of the village. As such, it is common for the deceased to be kept inside the home for months or even years before he receives a proper funeral and burial. After dying, the body is treated with various tree saps or formaldehyde to prevent decay. It is then placed in a cushioned blanket and then in a casket. That casket is kept in the home in which the person lived. Between the period of the corpse being placed in the home and his final funeral, he is never referred to as being dead. Instead, he is referred to as being sick. The coffin is typically placed in the children's room, and the children then sleep next to the coffin until the burial takes place. This coffin is never left alone during this period, and someone must always be in the house so the deceased is able to get food, drinks, and conversation. In this case, the deceased was a wealthy landowner with a large, successful, upscale restaurant. Despite his wealth, the entire living space of his home, with 3 generations living together, was smaller than the living room in our Honolulu condo. Our earlier slide showed the first day of the funeral event, in which the water buffaloes are sacrificed. Our next was for the second day of a funeral and was in the village of Limo. Mr. Rantilimo had 6 children, and 35 buffalo were sacrificed to aid his ascension into heaven on the prior day. A wooden effigy, or tautau, was created in his image, which resided over the festivities. As with the first funeral we reported on, there were 80 temporary structures built to shelter the guests. The second day of an upper-class funeral is primarily oriented around the sacrifice of pigs, 300 pigs for this funeral. Once the pigs are brought to the funeral grounds, they are laid out in a common area initially. They are then carried, still trussed and hung under bamboo poles, to the location where they will be killed. There is quite a debt accounting process for these funerals. The size and number of each gift animal is tracked, and also taxed by the government. Sometimes groups of people will combine their efforts to make a donation. If a person cannot afford a personal contribution, he gives an IOU to someone else who will then contribute the animals. These IOUs are considered sacrosanct and can never be forgiven, even being passed down to future generations if not repaid before the person passes. Once the pigs are quickly killed with a single sharp knife under the arm into the heart, the pigs are roasted with large blow torches, We shall allow the large animal to be fully cooked in just a few minutes. Teams of butchers then set to work to carve and distribute the meat. Each attending guest will receive a portion of the meat depending on their caste, their closeness to the deceased, and their level of effort in the funeral. All of this is part of an elaborate bartering system, and in the end, every piece of the animal is either used or bartered. There is no waste of any sacrificed animal. This is the last big party before the spirit of the deceased ascends to heaven, this time in the village of Kandiapi. Once the burial is complete, the spirit is finally released. It is a festive occasion with the family and friends carrying the deceased in a procession from the festival site to the final cave burial site. Those in this march carrying the bola bola seemed like a bunch of wild teenagers having fun, singing and laughing. Several times it seemed like the coffin would drop as the coffin was carried up the hill on a bamboo platform. There was drum beating, there were mud fights, there were cow fights, water fights, boys throwing each other into the rice fields, and dancing. There was not a tear in sight. The bola bola carried the deceased in a red mattress-like coffin. It was rocking and rolling around from the temporary festival grounds to the final gravesite on the cliff face. Sometimes it was actually dropped to the ground. The goal of the procession was to wake up the corpse so it would have one last look at the world that he is leaving. The bola bola, the funeral house transport, was brought up to the waiting grave slotted into the cliff wall. The body was placed into the grave, still wrapped in a soft cushion, and then the temporary wooden doors sealed over the hole. It was then time to celebrate, so the entire team of mostly teenagers gathered together. While shouting and pumping fists, other family members took the group photograph. There is much more depth to this society than I was able to show in this short time. Please visit our blog at www.mindstormphoto.com and enter a search for Toraja to see more, including many videos of these processions. We have never seen any other group of people so obsessed with death, but we have also rarely seen a group of people that seem so happy in their day-to-day life, despite a level of poverty that few Americans have ever seen. Their belief in life after death is not really all that different from many other religions, though they express it in a unique manner. Their massive animal sacrifices seem brutal at first, but they really are not. The animals are killed quickly, and the meat is then distributed to the entire community, providing their primary source of protein. This is a part of the world we had not even heard of before. We want to thank David Metcalf for showing it to us.